There is an advertisement that ran in American newspapers in 1885. It shows a smiling child, rosy cheeks, bright eyes, the kind of illustration that was meant to make a mother feel warm and reassured. And underneath the child's face in neat, confident lettering is the product being sold. It is cocaine. Not cocaine for adults, not cocaine for medical emergencies, cocaine for children. Cocaine marketed specifically, deliberately, cheerfully to the mothers of sick and teething and fussy children, with the same tone of wholesome domestic confidence that a modern advertisement might use to sell vitamin gummies or cough syrup. And here is the thing that will genuinely unsettle you about this. It was not a fringe product. It was not sold by criminals or quacks operating in the shadows. It was manufactured by some of the most respected pharmaceutical companies in the world. It was recommended by physicians. It was stocked by pharmacists in every town in America. It was as normal, as accepted, as unremarkable as aspirin is today. For roughly 40 years, from the 1880s to the early 1920s, cocaine and its close companion heroin were not dangerous illegal substances lurking at the edges of society. They were consumer products, household staples, things you picked up at the chemist along with your soap and your bandages and your cough drops. And the story of how this happened. How two of the most powerfully addictive substances ever identified by science became children's medicine, became soft drinks, became everyday household items, and the story of how it was eventually stopped, is one of the strangest and most consequential chapters in the history of medicine, business, and human folly that you will ever encounter. Let's start at the beginning, the real beginning. Not with the advertisements or the pharmacies or the smiling children on the labels. Let's start in the Andes Mountains roughly 5,000 years ago, where this story actually begins. The coca plant, Erythroxylum coca, for the botanically inclined, grows in the highland regions of South America, primarily in what is now Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia. Indigenous peoples of the Andes had been chewing its leaves for at least 5,000 years, possibly longer. The practice was embedded in their culture, their religion, their daily working life, and their medicine with a depth and sophistication that reflected millennia of accumulated knowledge about how the plant worked and what it could do. Coca leaves chewed in the traditional way, packed into the cheek with a small amount of an alkaline substance like lime or ash that helps release the active compounds, produce a mild, sustained stimulant effect. They reduce hunger and fatigue. They help the body cope with altitude. They numb pain slightly. They do not produce the dramatic, rapid high associated with refined cocaine, because the concentration of the active compound being absorbed is much lower and the absorption is much slower. For the people of the Andes, coca was medicine, nutrition, and sacred substance simultaneously. Inca priests used it in religious ceremonies. Workers in the silver mines of Potosi, the mines that produced so much of the silver that funded the Spanish Empire, were paid partly in coca leaves because their employers discovered early that workers who chewed coca could labor longer and harder in the brutal conditions of the high-altitude mines. The Spanish colonial authorities had a complicated relationship with coca from the beginning. Some priests condemned it as a pagan substance that needed to be eliminated along with other indigenous religious practices. Others argued pragmatically that if coca kept the mine workers productive, it was economically useful and should be tolerated. The pragmatists won, as pragmatists usually do when there is money involved. But Europe remained largely indifferent to coca for 3 centuries after the Spanish conquest, partly because the leaves lost most of their potency during the long ocean voyage from South America and arrived in Europe stale and largely ineffective, and partly because Europeans had their own stimulants, coffee, tea, alcohol, and were not especially looking for alternatives. Everything changed in 1860 when a German chemistry student named Albert Niemann successfully isolated the active alkaloid from coca leaves and gave it a name. He called it cocaine. Neiman tested it on himself, as chemists of the era routinely and recklessly did, and noted in his research paper that it produced a curious numbing sensation on the tongue and a feeling of energy and alertness. He died of other causes less than a year later before he could fully investigate what he had found. But the compound itself, pure, concentrated, extractable cocaine, was now a known quantity in the world of chemistry. And it sat there mostly unremarked upon for another 20 years, waiting for someone to pick it up and run with it. The person who picked it up and ran with it faster and further than anyone else was a 28-year-old Viennese neurologist with ambitions that vastly exceeded his current professional standing, and a personal history of chronic depression and exhaustion that made him personally motivated to find a chemical cure for both. His name was Sigmund Freud. Yes, that Sigmund Freud. In 1884, before he was famous, before psychoanalysis existed, before anyone outside a small circle of Viennese medical professionals had any idea who he was, Freud read a report about American army surgeons experimenting with cocaine to reduce fatigue in soldiers and became immediately, intensely interested. He obtained a supply of cocaine from the pharmaceutical company Merck. Cocaine was a perfectly legal commercial product available through normal pharmaceutical channels, and began a series of experiments on himself. He took it regularly. He shared it with friends and colleagues. He sent it to his fiancée Martha, writing her enthusiastic letters about how it lifted his mood and gave him energy and cured the depression that had haunted him for years. He described it as a magical substance. Then he wrote a paper. The paper, published in 1884, was called Über Coca on cocaine. It was an enthusiastic, comprehensive, and remarkably thorough review of everything then known about cocaine, combined with Freud's own personal observations about its effects. He described it as a treatment for depression, for fatigue, for digestive problems, for morphine and alcohol addiction, and for a range of other conditions. The paper on cocaine addiction treatment is particularly striking in retrospect. Freud genuinely believed that cocaine could cure addiction to other substances. He treated a colleague and close friend named Ernst von Fleschl-Marx, who had become addicted to morphine after a series of painful surgeries, by prescribing him cocaine as a substitute. Fleschl-Marx became addicted to cocaine as well. He developed what contemporary observers described as cocaine psychosis, hallucinations, paranoia, the sensation of insects crawling under his skin, a condition now known as formication. He died in 1891, aged 45, a wreck of the brilliant man he had once been. Freud, to his credit, acknowledged later in his life that the cocaine episode was one of the serious mistakes of his career. But by the time he acknowledged this, the damage was done. His paper had been widely read. The pharmaceutical industry had noticed. And cocaine was on its way to becoming one of the most aggressively marketed substances in the history of commerce. Because while Freud was writing his paper in Vienna, something else was happening in America. A Corsican businessman named Angelo Mariani had been selling a product called Vin Mariani since 1863. It was a wine, a Bordeaux, specifically infused with coca leaves, each fluid ounce of which contained approximately 6 milligrams of cocaine. This was not a medicine. It was a drink. A fashionable, popular, socially acceptable drink sold across Europe and America with a marketing campaign that was, by the standards of the 19th century, spectacularly sophisticated. Mariani collected testimonials, not from ordinary customers but from the most famous people in the world. Pope Leo XIII carried a personal flask of Vin Mariani. He awarded Angelo Mariani a special Vatican gold medal. Queen Victoria drank it. Thomas Edison drank it and said it helped him work. Ulysses Grant drank it while writing his memoirs racing against his terminal cancer. The writer Jules Verne drank it. The writer Arthur Conan Doyle, who would, with some irony, later give his creation Sherlock Holmes a cocaine habit, drank it. Mariani printed all of these endorsements in elaborate advertising booklets. The product became a global phenomenon, and it inspired imitations. In 1886, an Atlanta pharmacist and former Confederate Army officer named John Stith Pemberton was looking for a non-alcoholic alternative to Vin Mariani. Atlanta had recently gone dry, prohibiting alcohol sales, and Pemberton saw a market opportunity. He had already been selling a coca wine of his own, and he needed a substitute that would work without the wine. He invented a syrup made from coca leaf extract and cola nut which contained caffeine mixed with carbonated water. He called it Coca-Cola. The original Coca-Cola contained cocaine. The precise amount is debated by historians, but the cocaine content was real and measurable. Pemberton marketed it explicitly as a brain tonic and as a cure for morphine addiction, the same claim Freud had made about cocaine generally. He promoted it to customers as a medicine. By the early 1890s, Coca-Cola was being drunk across America. The company that bought the formula from Pemberton, the businessman Asag Griggs Candler, who purchased it in 1888 for around $2,000, one of the more consequential purchases in the history of America. Commerce continued to use coca leaf extract in the recipe. They would not fully remove the cocaine content until 1929, and the coca leaf extract decocainized with the cocaine removed before use is still part of the formula today. The name Coca-Cola refers to both the coca and the cola, and the company still imports coca leaves from Peru, processed to remove the cocaine. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because while Coca-Cola was building its empire, the pharmaceutical industry was doing something that makes the soft drink story look relatively innocuous. They were putting cocaine in medicine for children. The logic from a 19th-century medical perspective was not obviously insane. Cocaine is a genuinely effective local anesthetic. This is still true. It is still used in certain surgical procedures today. It numbs tissue very effectively. And for a teething child whose gums are inflamed and painful, the numbing effect of cocaine applied topically would have provided genuine, rapid, real relief. The problem that a 19th-century physician operating within the medical knowledge of the time did not necessarily know with any certainty was what else cocaine does when it enters the bloodstream. The numbing of the gums was real. The absorption of cocaine into a small child's bloodstream through the mucous membranes of the mouth was also real. And a child's nervous system is not a miniature adult nervous system. It is more sensitive to psychoactive substances, not less. The children given teething preparations containing cocaine were in many cases genuinely calmed by them. They stopped crying, they slept. Their mothers found the products effective and continued to purchase them. The feedback loop was exactly backwards from what it needed to be. The product worked in the short term in the way the parents wanted, and the long-term consequences, the addiction potential, the neurological effects were invisible. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, one of the most popular children's medicines of the late 19th century, contained morphine. Steedman's soothing powders contained cocaine. Dr. Fawley's teething syrup, Cop's baby friend, Mrs. Johnson's soothing syrup. The names were wholesome, the ingredients were not. These were not disreputable fringe products. They were mainstream, widely advertised, doctor-endorsed medicines sold in pharmacies and general stores across America and Britain. They were household names. Mothers passed recommendations for them to each other the way mothers today recommend particular brands of children's paracetamol. The teething syrup was only part of the picture. Cocaine was also sold as a treatment for hay fever and nasal congestion. It does genuinely reduce nasal swelling through its vasoconstrictive properties, in the form of nasal sprays and drops. Cocaine toothache drops. Cocaine throat lozenges for singers. cocaine injections for dental procedures, which was actually a legitimate and still used medical application, cocaine cigarettes marketed as a treatment for asthma, which delivered the drug in a particularly efficient form directly into the lungs. The pharmaceutical company Park, Davis and Company, a firm that is now part of Pfizer, sold cocaine in an extraordinary range of preparations. Cocaine solution, cocaine in a hypodermic needle kit, cocaine cigarettes, cocaine powder for nasal insufflation, cocaine in a cherry syrup for children. Their 1885 marketing literature described cocaine as capable of making the coward brave, the silent eloquent, and rendering the sufferer insensitive to pain. This was not fringe marketing. Park Davis was one of the most respected pharmaceutical companies in America. And while this was all happening, there was a very specific subtext operating in the background of American cocaine culture that most histories of the period do not address with sufficient directness. The medical and legal response to cocaine in America was not simply about health. It was also deeply, inextricably entangled with race. As cocaine use spread in the American South, newspapers began publishing stories, frequently fabricated or wildly exaggerated but widely believed, about African American men who had taken cocaine and became, according to these accounts, superhumanly strong, immune to bullets, sexually aggressive, and dangerous. Dr. Edward Williams of the New York Times wrote in 1914 that the cocaine nigger was a genuine threat to public safety, that cocaine made black men difficult to stop even with gunfire, and that law enforcement officers in the South needed to use larger caliber weapons because of this. This was not science, it was racist fantasy. But it was published in mainstream newspapers and taken seriously by legislators, and it became one of the driving arguments for anti-cocaine legislation. The first major federal anti-drug law in American history, the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914, was said in a political climate in which racial anxiety about cocaine use in black communities was being explicitly used as an argument for criminalization. This is not a footnote in the history of drug prohibition, it is one of the central strands of it. But there were also genuine, non-racist reasons why the tide was turning against cocaine by the first decade of the 20th century. The problem was increasingly visible. Cocaine addiction, real cocaine addiction, with its escalating doses, its personality changes, its paranoia and psychosis and physical deterioration, was showing up in patients in neighborhoods in published medical case reports. The doctors who had enthusiastically prescribed cocaine in the 1880s were by the 1900s seeing what long-term heavy use actually did to people. A Colorado physician named Selden Talcott published a paper in 1900 describing cocaine addicts in terms that were strikingly modern. The constant craving, the inability to stop despite wanting to, the destruction of relationships and careers and health, the way the drug seemed to take over the person using it. He called it a demon, and described his patients with a compassion that was not typical of the medical literature of the period. And then there was heroin. Because cocaine, extraordinary as its story is, was not even the most reckless pharmaceutical adventure of this era. Heroin was invented in 1898 by a chemist named Heinrich Dresser, working for the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company, the same Bayer that makes the aspirin in your medicine cabinet today. The drug had actually been synthesized earlier by various chemists, but Dresser was the one who recognized its commercial potential and pushed for its development and marketing. The name heroin was a Bayer trademark. It came from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic, because the test subjects who first tried the drug reportedly described feeling powerful and heroic. Bayer marketed heroin as a cough suppressant and as a non-addictive alternative to morphine. Let that sentence sit for a moment. Heroin, non-addictive, sold as an improvement over morphine. The logic was not entirely without foundation. Heroin is a more potent painkiller than morphine, meaning smaller doses achieve the same effect, and the clinical trials that Bayer conducted, which were inadequate by any modern standard but were considered acceptable for the period, did not immediately reveal the addiction problem, partly because the trials were short-term and partly because the test subjects, largely hospital patients already on morphine, were already dependent on opioids, and the shift to heroin did not immediately manifest as a distinct new addiction. Bayer sent free heroin samples to physicians across the world. They published advertisements in medical journals. They promoted it at medical conferences. They sold heroin cough syrup for children. Bayer Heroin Children's Cough Syrup. This is a real product. You can find photographs of the original packaging in archives. The instructions on the packaging recommended giving it to children in doses that would now be recognized as deeply dangerous. It was sold over the counter without prescription. A mother who had a child with a persistent cough could walk into any pharmacy and purchase heroin syrup without a doctor's involvement of any kind. The number of children who became addicted through heroin cough syrup is not known precisely, because nobody was counting, because addiction in children was not a recognized clinical category, because the connection between the calmed, sleepy child and the drug in the syrup was not one that parents or physicians were looking for. But we know it happened. We know it happened because the physicians who later dealt with heroin addiction, as it became unmistakably visible in American and European cities in the 1910s and 1920s, documented cases that traced back to childhood exposure through medical preparations. By 1906, the American Medical Association had published concerns about heroin addiction. By 1910, the evidence was overwhelming enough that the medical consensus had shifted from heroin as a useful medicine to heroin as a dangerous substance. But the legal framework to act on this consensus did not yet exist. In 1906, America had no federal food and drug law worth the name. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, passed partly in response to the horror of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which exposed conditions in the meatpacking industry, partly in response to growing concerns about patent medicines, required that products containing cocaine, heroin, morphine, and several other substances be labeled with the amount of those substances present. Labeling, not prohibition. You could still buy heroin, you just had to be told it contained heroin. The effect of the labeling requirement was not trivial. Some consumers, confronted with the information that their children's cough syrup contained a narcotic, stopped buying it. Sales of some patent medicines containing opiates and cocaine declined significantly after 1906. But other consumers simply did not care, or did not believe it was dangerous, or had children who were already dependent and did not know how to stop. The Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 was the first significant restriction. It did not prohibit cocaine or heroin. It taxed them, required registration of anyone who manufactured or dispensed them, and made it illegal to possess them without a tax stamp. In practice, because the tax stamp was extremely difficult for ordinary people to obtain, it functionally criminalized possession for non-medical purposes. But the act also created a loophole, or what was perceived as a loophole, for physicians to prescribe opiates to addicted patients to maintain their addiction, on the theory that this was a legitimate medical treatment. The Treasury Department, which administered the act, moved aggressively to close this loophole, prosecuting physicians who prescribed opiates to addicts as if they were drug dealers. Physicians stopped prescribing. Addicts were cut off from the medical supply. The consequence was predictable in retrospect. The though apparently not anticipated by the architects of the policy. A black market emerged, and the black market supplied a drug that was cheaper, more available, and more dangerous than anything the pharmaceutical companies had been selling because the black market had no quality control, no consistent dosing, and no label telling you what was in the product. The era of legal cocaine and heroin as consumer products was ending. The era of illegal cocaine and heroin as criminal enterprise was beginning. The children's medicine aisle of the pharmacy would never look quite the same again. But here is the thing about this story that most people miss because the history of drugs is usually told as a moral tale. The discovery of danger, the realization of harm, the righteous legal response, and moral tales tend to flatten the complexity of what actually happened. The pharmaceutical companies that manufactured cocaine children's medicine were not, for the most part, deliberately harming children. They operated within the medical knowledge of their time, which did not include a clear understanding of addiction as a neurological phenomenon, of the particular vulnerability of the developing brain to psychoactive substances, or of the difference between short-term relief and long-term harm. They were not saints. They were businesses, and the profit motive meant they were not looking very hard for evidence that their products were dangerous. But they were not cartoonish villains either. The physicians who prescribed cocaine and heroin were not, for the most part, corrupt or negligent in terms of the standards of their time. They were working with the information available to them, within a regulatory framework that placed no meaningful restriction on what they could recommend, and they were observing short-term effects, the calm teething child, the suppressed cough, the relieved hay fever, without having the tools or the framework to track long-term outcomes. The parents who gave their children cocaine syrup were not child abusers. They were parents trying to relieve their children's suffering with the tools that their doctors endorsed and their pharmacists stocked and their neighbors recommended. This is the part of the story that should sit with you because it is not comfortably historical. It does not stay in the past. Because in your lifetime, probably in the last 20 years, the same pattern has played out again. Not with cocaine, not with heroin, with opioid painkillers. OxyContin, manufactured by Purdue Pharma, was approved by the FDA in 1995 and marketed aggressively by a company that presented it as a safer, less addictive alternative to other opioid pain medications. Sound familiar? Purdue sales representatives told physicians that OxyContin's release formula made it less prone to abuse. The company pushed for prescriptions for increasingly non-severe pain. Physicians who raised concerns about addiction were dismissed or ignored. By 2017, more than 200,000 Americans had died from prescription opioid overdoses since OxyContin entered the market. 200,000 people dead from a drug that was sold to them by a pharmaceutical company as safer and less addictive than the alternatives, prescribed by physicians who trusted the company's marketing materials, dispensed by pharmacists who stocked it in the medicine aisle, taken by patients who had no reason to believe they were being misled. The children's cocaine syrup of 1895 and the OxyContin prescription of 2005 are separated by 110 years and an enormous accumulation of medical knowledge. They are connected by something that did not change at all in the intervening century: the pharmaceutical industry's willingness to prioritize the evidence that served its interests, the regulatory system's inability to move faster than the harm, and the human tendency to trust the medicine that the respectable, professional, doctor-endorsed system is selling. So the next time you walk down the medicine aisle of a pharmacy, past the bright packaging and the confident claims and the photographs of smiling children, it is worth pausing for just a moment. Not in paranoia, not in the belief that everything on those shelves is dangerous or that the system has learned nothing. but in the recognition that the mothers who bought cocaine teething syrup in 1890 also walked down a medicine aisle. They also looked at bright packaging and confident claims and photographs of smiling children. They also trusted the pharmacist behind the counter and the physician who endorsed the product and the society that had decided, through its accumulated systems of regulation and professional judgment, that this was safe enough to sell. They were not stupid, they were not negligent, they were not different from you. They were just living 40 years before the world figured out what they were being sold. And the question that this history leaves hanging, unanswered in the air, the question that every generation has to ask itself about the confident, professional, heavily marketed medicine of its own time, is a simple one. What is it that we are selling to our children right now that we will spend the next 40 years trying to explain? We do not know the answer yet. But history suggests we are selling something.